Good evening. Welcome to Viterbo University and to this year's Aldo Leopold Week. We've got the event this evening to kind of initiate the series of events we'll be having, and then Saturday at the Upper Mississippi River National Wildlife and Refuge Visitor Center on Bryce Prairie, there's going to be events starting at 10 a.m. Craig Thompson, who's works for the Wisconsin DNR, is going to give a presentation called Birder-in-Chief, Teddy Roosevelt's Bird Conservation Legacy. And at 11 a.m. there will be a nature walk with students from UWL featuring readings by Aldo Leopold, Teddy Roosevelt, and some other conservation writers. So we invite you to participate in those events coming up Saturday. And now, ladies and gentlemen, our speaker tonight was born in New York City, New York. He was born on October 27, 1858. He graduated Phi Beta Kappa and magna cum laude from Harvard University. As a young man, he became a cattle rancher in the Dakota Territory and ran unsuccessfully for the New York mayorship. He was appointed a United States Civil Service Commissioner and served as president of the New York City Board of Police Commissioners. He served as the Assistant Secretary of the United States Navy and Colonel of the 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry. He was Governor of New York, Vice President of the United States, and President of the United States, all by the age of 42.
It was a pretty good start.
He was the father of 6 children and the author of over 30 books. He was a leading ornithologist, a big game hunter, and a founder of Boone and Crockett, the nation's first fair hunting and conservation organization. During his presidency, he declared some 230 million acres of national parks, national forests, bird sanctuaries, national monuments, and game preserves. He was indeed the greatest...
Bully!
He was indeed the greatest conservation president. Ladies and gentlemen, Teddy Roosevelt.
Thank you so very much, and thank you, Professor Richard Pike in Viterbo University. I am Theodore Roosevelt, and I'm delighted to be with you here in La Crosse, Wisconsin this evening. And how it's done this old politician's heart good. I arrived on campus, and everyone recognized me. They said, "Hello, Teddy," and "Good evening, Mr. President." My friends know that in my retirement, I prefer to be called by my old military title, Colonel, for my brief time in the 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry, and indeed, history remembers us as the Rough Riders. All of those greetings, historically accurate, do stand in such stark contrast to the young man that saw me down on 3rd Street this afternoon. Well, I had my top hat. He pointed at me and told his friends, he said, "Look, there's the Monopoly dude." Quite humbling for an old politician, I assure you. And if he knew his history as well as the good students here, he would have known that I was the anti-Monopoly dude, the great trust buster. Well, we are here to celebrate conservation and Aldo Leopold, his land ethic, his Sand County Almanac, his legacy. We each leave a legacy, and I hope that by the time my brief remarks are concluded this evening, that you too will be re-inspired to leave your campground cleaner than you found it. Well, Aldo Leopold, famous for his work in Wisconsin, but his roots downriver at Burlington, Iowa, and then off to Yale's School of Forestry, the benefactors, the Pinchot family. And when Aldo Leopold in 1909 joined the United States Forest Service, it was a forest service that Gifford Pinchot and I had built. In 1905, Congress passed the Transfer Act. The Transfer Act transferred the Bureau of Forestry from the Department of the Interior, where it was a small bureau reporting to the General Land Office, much abused by the lumber industry and staffed by a handful of clerks, mostly ne'er-do-well nephews and cousins of members of Congress, few, if any, of whom had ever seen a board foot of lumber, and most with the intellectual capacity of your average balloon. Under Pinchot's leadership, the Transfer Act transferred that bureau to the Department of Agriculture. The United States Forest Service was born, and year after year, the young graduates of that first and perhaps best school of forestry, Yale, turned out the graduates that filled the ranks of the United States Forest Service, and amongst the first was young Aldo Leopold. His adventure was in the American Southwest, in Arizona Territory, and his impact is, again, a legacy that still impacts us today. The idea of the national wilderness was an idea that came from young Aldo Leopold. The idea of game management done by the parks and by the wildlife personnel, those came from Aldo Leopold as well, and from friends and colleagues. Let us not forget that in the cause of preserving our national lands, it was very often the women, the women's clubs, the parks associations, the garden clubs, they knew what we know today, that it would be so important to get the young people outdoors that they might enjoy the adventures like young Aldo Leopold had in the countryside, along the Mississippi, and out in the farm fields. Our youth was somewhat similar, Aldo Leopold and I, though you heard, I'm from New York City. But even in New York City, even in a big city like La Crosse, a child can find nature, especially if led there by an adult. Nearby my birthplace, I had Gramercy Park. And as a young boy, my parents indulged me in my interest in natural science, allowing me and my brother Elliot and our Roosevelt cousins who lived right next door to spend a good portion of the day wandering through the parks. Mr. Olmsted's great Central Park with its American Museum of Natural History attendant there too, another of my playgrounds. Of course, its eastern facade today and its great hall, the official New York State memorial to my life. The charter for that great museum, signed in the Roosevelt family living room, its first director recruited to the city by my father, and a Roosevelt family member on its board since its inception. Of course, the great hall of African mammals collected by me and my son Kermit in British East Africa after my presidency. But deeper in the recesses of that great museum, birds' eggs and mice skeletons donated by one young Theodore Roosevelt of 28 East 20th Street. We would wander along as well the wharves of the East River and the Hudson River that define Lower Manhattan Island, and all along the way we collected snakes and bugs and turtles and birds, squirrels and rats and mice, alive or dead, it did not matter. We brought these creatures home and had on the fourth floor of our home something that we called Roosevelt's Museum of Natural History. A very wide-ranging, though as any mother might suspect, a truly malodorous collection. You had to be careful coming to my house. If you poured yourself a glass of water from the pitcher, a snake might fall out of the pitcher and into your glass. For that's where I was keeping my snake cool. If you reached into the icebox for a snack, you might pull out my collection of mice awaiting my experiments. One afternoon, I was walking up Broadway Avenue. I saw Mrs. Hamilton Fish, wife of the United States Secretary of State, walking down. I thought I should have some display of gentlemanly conduct, that a report of my gentlemanly conduct might go home to my mother, much to my own benefit. Pride before the fall. As I passed Mrs. Fish in the street, I tipped my hat and wished her a good day. And when I did so, 2 frogs fell out from beneath my hat and fell upon her shoes. I'm afraid that the report that went home was not of my gentlemanly conduct. Odd that my life and legacy are so closely associated with the western states, the open spaces of the national parks and the national forests, and the strenuous life that I lived and preached. For not only growing up in New York City, then a city of 1 million souls and 500,000 horses, the city covered in sewerage of all sorts, and a heavy black soot as we burned coal fires in our fireplaces, and diseases like cholera and typhoid running rampant. And indeed, I was a weak and sickly child, far from the strenuous life. The strain for me was gathering the breath to blow out the candle beside my bed. Today, thank goodness, an asthmatic child has an inhaler to restore breath, hopefully quickly. In my day, we had no such medicine. In my day, the treatment for asthma was worse than the disease. Can you imagine giving a small asthmatic boy a cigar to smoke? The idea was that coughing would stimulate my breathing. I was given bitter black coffee to drink, again as a stimulant, became quite addicted to the bean as an adult, drank 1.5 gallons of coffee each and every day. And I was given ipecac syrup to drink. Oh, I hear from your groans, and see by your grimaces, some of you are of an age, those of you with a bit of snow atop the peak, or not too much atop the peak, well, you know ipecac syrup. The younger generation, the college students, might not have. Ipecac syrup is something that you drink in order to see your lunch. Twice. Unpleasant memories for me to this very day. When I was a small boy, not yet 11, my father, Theodore Roosevelt, the man for whom I'm named, and the greatest man I ever knew, he called me into his study for a heart-to-heart talk. I knew the subject was of importance, for rather than calling me by the diminutive nickname by which I was known in the family, TD, he said, "Theodore, you have the mind, but you have not the body. Without the aid of the body, the mind cannot go as far as it otherwise should. It is hard work and drudgery, but you must make your body." I said, "Father, I shall." And I set out to make my body with calisthenics. I lifted weights, I swam, I rowed. I worked on the parallel bars and on the rings. I even took boxing lessons in the classical manner. And I built my body. And it does appear I may have overdone it just a bit. But when I was your president at 5'8" and 220 solid pounds, I was but a mere feather of a man. Compared to my successor, William Howard Taft. At times, Taft tipped the scales at over 350 pounds. And yes, it's true, he once got stuck in the White House bathtub. When I was a little boy, it was my father that got me breath and got me life, sometimes holding me aloft through the night that I might breathe. And when my asthma attacks were at their worst, my father, in the middle of the night, would have the horses brought round to the front of the house and tied to the carriage. And with me, bundled in blankets, seated beside my father in the front seat of the carriage, my father would speed that carriage through the streets of New York in the hopes of rushing air to my young and sickly lungs. Physicians today tell me that rather than the speed of the conveyance, it was likely the excitement of the ride that naturally produced adrenaline in my bloodstream and assisted me to breathe. Perhaps no more important thing for me as a young asthmatic boy than the fact that my father would very often take me out into the countryside, out into the hills of northern New Jersey, where 30 years later, young Aldo Leopold himself would hike about as he was a student at the Lawrenceville School. I would go out to Oyster Bay, Long Island, where we had mornings on horseback, or up into the Hudson River Valley, hikes of 15, 20 miles, and how I enjoyed being with my father and God's great creation. In our family, we called my father Greatheart. I wonder if anyone anymore reads Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. Well, I hope the ethics students might do so. It's a quick read. Bunyan teaches us by allegory, and it's there that Greatheart leads Christian and other pilgrims past places with which you might still be familiar today. Vanity Fair, from which the magazine derives its name, the Slough of Despond, and the place with the men with the muckrakes in their hands, men so busy raking up the muck and mire of human existence that they fail to look up and see that salvation is offered right before them. Hence the phrase I coined when I was your president, the muckraking press. I was not paying a compliment to the yellow journalists of my day. My father lived the gospel. A founding member of the Children's Orthopedic Hospital, the first hospital in New York City to provide free surgeries for the crippled children of the day. A funder of the Children's Home and Aid Society, an organization that saw successfully the adoption of thousands of New York City orphans by Midwest and Western farm families. And by turn, my father would take one of us Roosevelt children by the hand and take us to the newspaper boys' lodging house, where the newsies, the orphan boys who spent morning, noon, and night on the filthy streets of New York selling newspapers for a penny or two apiece, because of the work of my father and other gentlemen, at night, those boys had a warm and safe place to sleep, a good meal, and on Sundays, Bible study taught by my father. I would later in life, during my presidency, always consider what would Father do when I was pressed with an important issue. My father, I was homeschooled myself and was taught my lessons by my Aunt Anna Bullock. But through tutoring, I qualified my entrance examination for Harvard College. I must assure you that I did not learn much of practical value at Harvard. The school was overrun by the sons of Boston Brahmins, themselves with no more aspiration than themselves be a Boston Brahmin someday. And while they laconically strolled across the quad, I ran from class to class and was very frequently, as an interrogator of my professors, bound to hear something like, "Now see here, Mr. Roosevelt, I'm teaching this class." When my father sent me from New York City to Harvard my freshman year, he did so with these words. He said, "Theodore, first, take care of your morals. Second, your health. And third, your studies." My father was the only man of whom I was ever really afraid. But in a good sense of the word, I never wanted to disappoint my father. Hence my working hard as a student and graduating near the top of my class. My father came to visit me at Harvard my freshman year and asked me that question that perhaps some of the students here have been asked by your parents while you're away. He said, "Theodore, what do you plan to do with yourself professionally?" I said, "Father, I think I should like to be a natural scientist." He said, "Theodore, that's fine, as long as you are not a dilettante, as long as you do serious work." The family had done well enough in business that my family eventually would not need to worry about its bread. "If, however, Theodore," my father said, "you have a taste for jam and butter, you had better get about the plan for the jam and the butter." My father taught me in this issue of home economics, if I wasn't going to add to the value of the numerator in life, I must reduce my expenses and thereby reduce the denominator of life and keep the fraction of life constant. It is still hard to put to words what a terrible blow it was to me my sophomore year at Harvard when my father died quickly and suddenly of stomach cancer. He but a young man of 46. The entire city of New York was in mourning, and I was in a terribly foul mood, writing in my diary to my siblings that I thought I might go insane from sadness. My tutor, Arthur Cutler, knew that in the past, being outdoors had not only restored my health but my spirits. That summer he sent me to the north woods of Maine, to the great Aroostook country along the Penobscot River. And there I hunted and hiked and canoed. We climbed Katahdin, the highest point in Maine, famous today as the northern terminus of the Great Appalachian Trail. We visited the lumber camps, where my vocabulary was greatly expanded. Each and every morning, before we had our adventures, I took my own canoe to a place where the west branch of Lake Mattawamkeag River is joined by First Brook. And there in the early morning lights, by the sound of those waters joining gently, I began each and every day, as my late father would have me do, with Bible devotion. In the years hence, the people of the state of Maine have seen fit to name that little point of land a state historic site called Bible Point, so named for the fact that I, as a young man, sought and found the wisdom, comfort, and solace of the good book there. I would later in life say that a thorough knowledge of the Bible was worth more than a college education, and would also criticize the content of education. One man with a differing opinion, he said, "Now, see here, Roosevelt, don't you understand that without an education a man might steal from a railroad car?" I said that might be true, but with the wrong sort of education, a man might steal an entire railroad, and has. I would return to Harvard, throw myself into my studies my junior year. But as many a young man of that age is wont to do, I fell in love with young Alice Hathaway Lee, the most beautiful girl in Boston at the time. 17 years old, the cousin of a classmate of mine. They'd lived as neighbors some 6 miles distant from Cambridge on Chestnut Hill. In my junior year, well-worn was the pathway between Cambridge and Chestnut Hill. So much so that in the spring of my junior year, I proposed marriage to Alice, and she refused me. In the fall of my senior year, I proposed marriage to Alice again, and she refused me again. But it's doggedness that does it. Persistence wins the prize. Oh, today you might call it stalking. No. Alice relented to my proposals, making me the happiest man in the world, agreeing to be my bride. Now, I do understand occasionally a married man has trouble remembering the date of his wedding anniversary. I took care of this. Alice and I were married on my birthday. We honeymooned but briefly. I knew that a man's first responsibility was to pull his own weight, to provide for his family. But I'd soured on natural science, at least the way natural science was taught at Harvard in those days, where a natural scientist was supposed to be a man indoors, looking at specimens through a microscope and doing dissections. Nothing like the great outdoor field work of Audubon and others with which I had fallen in love as a young man. I enrolled in Columbia Law School, thinking to follow two of my late father's brothers into the practice of law, and soon became doubly frustrated at law school. Speaking of ethics, I discovered at law school that rather than teaching a lawyer to fight for righteousness and justice, at law school a lawyer is taught to fight for a good outcome for his or her client, regardless of whether the outcome is truly righteous or just. That is probably the way the teaching and the practice of law needs to be, but it's not how I wanted to spend my life professionally. Each and every day, marching the many miles between home and Columbia Law, twice each day, I passed the local Republican headquarters. Not surprisingly, above the local saloon. And much to the horror of my family, I inquired about becoming involved, was embraced by the young men there, and ran successfully for the New York General Assembly, being elected its youngest member at the age of 23. As I left for Albany, the state capital, to take the oath of office, the erroneous words of one of my cousins were still ringing in my ears. He said, "Theodore, don't you understand the Greek etymology of the word politics? Poly meaning many, and ticks being blood-sucking insects." Off to Albany I went, and I was soon there known as the Cyclone Assemblyman. Oh, the cartoonists had a great deal of fun at my expense, but I was the man with the sun in his face. Happy indeed in great part, because life offers no greater reward than working hard at work worth doing. Happier still for the fact that Alice and I were expecting our first child. Happy was the day when the telegram came to the floor in Albany, announcing that Alice and I were the parents of a healthy baby girl. Congratulations were all about. Even my political opponents were happy for me. But then a second and most ominous telegram came. That telegram sent me for the train, on the train down the Hudson Valley, racing to my family home in the middle of the night, where my brother Elliot answered the door with these words. He said, "There is a curse upon this house. Mother is dying, and Alice is too." On the morning of February 14th, St. Valentine's Day, 1884, my dear, sweet, widowed mother, Martha Mitty Bullock Roosevelt, the Rose of Roswell, Georgia, she died of typhoid fever. That afternoon, beneath the same roof and in my arms, my dear, sweet bride Alice, she but 22, and a new mother. She died of Bright's disease, a kidney disease, now quite treatable by modern medicine. There's nothing in my diary that day but a large black X. And the words, "The light has gone out of my life." I thought forever. A friend wrote of the twin funeral 2 days later. Theodore knows neither what he does nor says. But I was a man of the Christian faith. And my faith told me my loved ones were not gone, but gone before. And I took courage from the words of my late father, who said, "Dark care seldom sits behind the rider whose pace is swift enough. Get action." Action I got. I had the baby named Alice for her late mother. Cared for by my sister Anna, known as Bammy in the family, I returned to Albany, threw myself into the work of my legislative committee, some nights spending the night sleepless, turning out 7 or 8 handwritten bills of legislation each and every night. The legislature adjourned. I went to New York City and saw to family affairs. Took the train west to Chicago, participated in my first Republican National Convention, leading the effort successfully to see the first man of color, Congressman John Lynch of Mississippi, a former slave, seated as a temporary chairman of a great National Party convention. The convention over, I did not return east to New York City, but took the train so much further west to where the newly constructed Northern Pacific Railroad crossed the Little Missouri River in the Badlands of what was then Dakota Territory, where the previous fall, in the after excitement of a successful bison hunt, I'd written a check to purchase 450 head of cattle and to hire men to be my cattle ranch foremen. I was now a cattle rancher. If you think those rough-and-tumble politicians of Albany, New York thought me a strange fellow, and they did, imagine how the cowboys and ranchers of the Dakota Territory regarded me when I got off that Northern Pacific train. I was not of their kind. I actually carried and read books, had and used a toothbrush. I had silver cowboy spurs, a silver cowboy belt buckle, and a silver hunting knife, jeweled at Tiffany & Company. My glasses were some sort of sign of a moral defect in a man's character. They called me storm windows and four eyes, but never to my face, only Mr. Roosevelt. I had one distinct advantage. I was the cattle rancher. I owned the cattle. The cowboys worked for me, and I earned their respect by working alongside them. When they were in saddle, so was I, sometimes riding the trail herd at the most monotonous of paces, 16, 18 hours a day in saddle, then to be greeted by sudden excitement as we stopped stampedes or raced the herd across rivers brimmed with running ice. It was still then, in the badlands of the Dakota Territory, the Wild West, the west of the Indian and the buffalo hunter, the soldier and the cowpuncher, the west of Owen Wister's stories, Frederick Remington's and Charlie Russell's paintings and drawings, the west where I indeed could ride for days and not even see another soul, the game and wildlife staring silently as I rode by. I slept at night with nothing but a billion stars for a blanket, woke in the morning to the smell of sage in the air. 'Twas not all romance. We knew toil, hardship, hunger, and thirst. We worked beneath the blazing summer sun and with the bitter bite of winter in our faces. We saw men die violent deaths amongst the horses and the cattle or in evil feuds with one another. But ours was the glory of work and the joy of living as free men on the cattle range, the beat of hearty life in our veins. Many were the adventures and misadventures I had along the Little Missouri. My first ranch was known as the Maltese Cross Ranch, also the Chimney Butte, about 6 miles south of the little village of Medora, hemmed in by other ranching operations. I brought 2 men from the north woods of Maine, Sewell and his nephew Dow, out to run a second ranch for me. My neighbors told me of some bottomlands about 30 miles north of Medora and downstream on the Little Missouri, without a neighbor for 10 or 15 miles on any side and plenty of free government grass. I walked those bottomlands the late summer of '84 with Sewell and Dow. A great stand of cottonwood trees, sufficient to make a nice ranch house and ancillary buildings, might have explained why I brought out 2 men from the north woods of Maine, neither of whom had any experience with cattle. I don't think Bill Sewell had ever ridden on a horse. But they were mighty with the axe. I joined them for a day of chopping. We returned to the cowboy camp that night, and one of the cowboys inquired of young Wilmot Dow how we'd done. I know Wilmot did not know that I was within earshot, for he replied, "Bill cut down 52 trees, I cut down 49, and the boss, he beavered down 17. I know here you know the work of a beaver and how it hit the mark with regards to my comparative skills with the axe. When we walked those bottomlands, many were the shed elk antler that we found. Of particular interest, 2 pair of elk antler, their skulls intact, showing that the great beasts had locked themselves in mortal combat, of course leading to the dehydration and death of each of the beasts. Hence the name of my second ranch, the Elkhorn Ranch. Some called it the cradle of conservation, for some of the early writings I did there with regards to the preservation of our wildlife and its habitat, for I had become greatly concerned. Traveling, as I often did, between the Badlands and my native New York City, where I would visit to see to family and to avoid some of the bitterest of the Dakota winter, as I traveled, I saw that much of the land in between had been ruined, hunted out, the wildlife scarce, the forest clear-cut, the rivers polluted. And it began to dawn upon me that future generations would hold us in shame, not for what we had used, but for what we had wasted. And so the idea of founding Boone and Crockett, named for my heroes Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett, came to mind for me and other gentlemen, George Bird Grinnell. Others joined, and your own Aldo Leopold would join Boone and Crockett. This wonderful melding of hunting and conservation realizing that the big game of this continent, the big game of Africa, it's been saved by the hunter who is the conservationist. And so traveling back and forth between the Dakotas and New York City, I would write my sisters that I would come to visit, and instructed my sisters that when I did visit, that under no circumstances should an old childhood sweetheart, Edith Carroll, be anywhere about. I was a Victorian. I did not approve of second marriages. I did not want to be tempted. And thank goodness, sisters don't always do what brothers ask them to do. On one return visit there in the parlor was Edith. We began to see each other socially, became secretly engaged. I returned to the Badlands. I hunted and wrote and ranched. And then came the terrible winter of 86, 87. By this time, Edith and I had married and had gone on honeymoon in Europe. Word came to us from the Badlands, and I came out to look about in 1887. And I saw that that terrible blue winter, a winter during which for 30 days the snow accumulated, and afterwards the temperature did not rise above 0 degrees Fahrenheit for another 30 days. 2/3 of my cattle starved, and many a man lost his fortune. So I came up a cropper on the cattle ranch. But still, I would later in life tell the people of Fargo that I would have never been president but for my experiences there. Some of you here are fortunate to know there's nothing so good for the inside of a man or a woman as the outside of a horse. It was riding my horse, Manitou, across the buttes and through the coulees of the Badlands, hunting in the regions of Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming beyond, that even I healed. So I would then enter my career in public service, and I too hoped that I might be judged to have left my campground cleaner than I found it. I was appointed a United States Civil Service Commissioner by President Benjamin Harrison, a Republican from Indiana, and then I set about fighting corruption in his own Republican regime. I did such a good job that some years later, President Cleveland, a Democrat, he'd been governor when I'd been leader of the House Republicans, he appointed me as well, a job I gave up to become the president of the New York City Board of Police Commissioners. And it was there that I was famous for Roosevelt's midnight rambles. When I would go about the precincts of New York City, and wherever I found a police officer derelict of duty, sleeping on a park bench, or worse yet, sitting on a tavern stool, the next morning at 8 o'clock that man was up on charges before the police commission. There was a terrible trouble with corruption in the police force when I came on board. Most of the police officers had purchased their position on the force and kicked a portion of their salary up to the captain, who kicked it up to the superintendent, who kicked it over to the ward heeler. And one of the ways that money came into the police department, into the grease the palms of the officers in any case, was that there was a blue law in New York City then. It was the prohibition of the sale of brewed and distilled spirits on Sundays. And while the front door of the tavern was locked and the blinds drawn, very often the alley door was left open on a Sunday. New York City then was a city full of men of German and Italian and Irish heritage. And working 6 days a week, those men thought it their providential right to drink in public on the 7th. I saw those taverns shut down on Sundays. A great brouhaha. The New York Times reported that it was the driest summer in New York City history. The tavern owners were a very important lot politically. They went to Albany and had the laws changed, such that any tavern that had on its premises 10 or more beds would be considered an inn and would be exempt from the law. I can only tell you that adding 10 beds to the typical tavern in New York City had certain unintended consequences. Enough of having fought corruption in New York City. I was appointed Assistant Secretary of the United States Navy, the number 2 man at the Navy. And the thing that I enjoyed most about that position was that when the elderly Secretary of the Navy, the former Governor Long of Massachusetts, when he was away from the nation's capital, it left me as the acting secretary in the pilot house of the Navy. I did my best to encourage the secretary to take long vacations and extra holidays away from the nation's capital, especially in the heat of summer. I was known as the warm weather secretary. And it was from that position that I resigned to take up my colonelcy in the 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry when the battleship Maine was sunk at Havana Harbor, and I answered the call of duty as I saw it to do. Lucky to get into the war in Cuba, lucky to get out, and lucky to rise like a rocket in politics subsequently. I served as governor of New York and had my first at-length conversation with Gifford Pinchot about forestry. He was then serving as a consultant in this previously mentioned Bureau of Forestry. He came to New York that I might consult him with regards to legislation being considered for my beloved Adirondack State Park. And when he arrived in Albany, he came around the corner and saw the executive mansion and saw me lowering the Roosevelt children out of a 3rd-floor window on a rope made of bed sheets. We were under attack by Indians. Before we did our forest good, I invited Pinchot to my office. We pushed all of the furniture to the walls. We rolled out a wrestling mat, and we proceeded to box and to wrestle. The future forester, he would brag for the rest of his career that he knocked the future president off his pins. But I ask you, who do you think won the wrestling match? I was hopeful to serve a second 2-year term as governor of New York, hoping to be reelected in 1900. But I was fighting against corruption in the Republican Party in New York and for decent legislation, and advocated the taxation of certain public monopolies like the elevated train and the gas company, monopolies that made millions in profits for their shareholders and paid not 1 red cent to the public treasury. This idea of taxing these firms was too much for the Republican leadership, and they decided to send me away. You have heard of the New England mother. She had 2 sons. One went off to sea. The other became vice president of the United States, and neither was ever heard from again. Senator Thomas Collier Platt, the big boss of New York from Owego, New York, arranged for me to be unanimously nominated to President McKinley's re-election ticket, Vice President Hobart of New Jersey having died in office. I say unanimously, every vote but one, my own. I said I would rather be a history professor than be vice president, but once elected, felt it my duty to serve. Senator Mark Hanna of Cleveland, Ohio, McKinley's mentor and chairman of the Republican National Committee. Upon our election, he told his fellow Republicans, "Don't you realize what you've done? That madman cowboy is but 1 life from the presidency." And how sadly prophetic, Senator Hanna's words. September 6th, 1901, President McKinley greeting visitors in Buffalo, New York at the Pan American Expo, and one man in the reception line making his way with what appeared to be a bandage upon his hand. And when McKinley extended the hand of peace and fellowship, a mad, cowardly anarchist, Leon Czolgosz, shot the president twice with a revolver concealed in his fake bandage. McKinley, the last president to have served in the Civil War. President during the annexation of Hawaii. He indeed wanted a full lunch bucket for the American voter. Prosperity at home and respect abroad. His last words in that public setting to the police officers manhandling the assassin, "Take it easy on him, boys." I myself that day had been preparing to address a fish and game dinner in Vermont on Lake Champlain at Isle de Motte. And the only phone on the island rang at Lieutenant Governor Fisk's house, and the bad news from Buffalo. It sent me by steamboat to Burlington, by train to Buffalo. There, the cabinet members assembled, and the president's physicians assured us that the president would recuperate from his wounds. The cabinet felt it would do the nation's anxiety and Wall Street's anxiety some good if the vice president was seen to go on a planned family vacation with my family awaiting me in the Adirondack Mountains. And I went, and remember it well, for my son Ted Jr. shot his first buck. I did no hunting. I was to climb Mount Marcy. Pinchot and the artist LaForge had done it hand over head in a blizzard the previous February, and I wasn't about to be bested by Pinchot again. So I marched my way up to the top of Mount Marcy, and coming down at Lake Tear of the Clouds, the source waters of the Hudson, having lunch of oxtail on knife point out of the can, I saw a hunting guide known to me running through the woods with what appeared to be bad news in his hand, and indeed it was from Buffalo, from the cabinet. The president was thought to be dying, and I was needed there. Unfortunately for President McKinley, the two physicians treating his wounds were both obstetricians, neither of whom had ever treated a gunshot wound in his practice. I raced down Mount Marcy in a rainstorm, changing horses and buckboards twice, and arriving at North Creek Depot. And there at 6 o'clock in the morning, handed a telegram, that from Secretary of State John Hay, he who had been Private Secretary to Lincoln in his youth and friend of my father. At 2:15 that morning, as I descended Mount Marcy, President McKinley had died. I was now your 26th president. I raced to Buffalo to pay condolences to Mrs. McKinley. And then, in a private residence, Ainslie Wilcox home, in a borrowed suit, I took the oath of office without a Bible at hand, simply stating beforehand that it would be my aim that the policies of the McKinley administration for the peace, prosperity, and honor of the American people would remain entirely unbroken. Life at the White House was about to become quite a different thing. We gave Mrs. McKinley some time to move out of the White House, and then Mrs. Roosevelt arrived with our 6 children. You realize Mrs. Roosevelt and I reared 6 children at the White House. Mrs. Roosevelt claimed she reared 7 children there, and that I was her worstest and most terrible child. I don't believe any president ever enjoyed himself in the White House as much as I did, and certainly no family ever enjoyed themselves more than the Roosevelt family. 6 children, and most of them small, such that the head White House usher for decades, Mr. Ike Hoover, he wrote of the Roosevelt years, "It was no time for a person with a nervous constitution to be working at the White House. The older boys would jump out of giant vases like jack-in-the-boxes just as startled visitors walked by, or come careening down the grand staircase riding on cookie trays stolen from the kitchen. My daughter Alice was 17 when we entered the White House, and her behavior was scandalous. Alice smoked cigarettes in public. She flirted with Army and Navy officers. When the White House punch was discovered spiked, we knew who the culprit was. Alice kept a snake in her purse and introduced the snake as Emily Spinach at diplomatic dinners and receptions, sometimes wearing that little green snake as a bracelet around her wrist or a necklace around her neck. Oh, I put my foot down. I said, Alice, no daughter of mine will smoke beneath my roof. Alice was often seen smoking on the White House roof. During one afternoon conference with an old friend, Alice continuously and exuberantly interrupted. Finally, in exasperation, my friend said, Mr. President, can't you control your daughter Alice? I said, sir, I can either run the country or I can control Alice. I cannot possibly do both. Alice was famously and thankfully married at the White House in 1906 to Congressman Nicholas Longworth of Cincinnati, Ohio. He in the future a Speaker of the United States House of Representatives. Some of your congressional delegation may serve in the Longworth House Office building. The wedding was a great success. Your grandparents may have played the song Alice's Blue Gown in the parlor, the color Alice blue, popular for decades in women's fashion and home decor. The wedding was a great success. The marriage was a challenge to all parties concerned. Congressman Longworth had trouble controlling Alice. She even more trouble controlling him. But Alice was a woman ahead of her time, very often sought out by members of the press for her statements with regards to policies, her endorsements of candidates, or just her quick wit, always ready with a quip, even in her saddest moments. Longworth died in 1931 during the Hoover administration, buried in his native Cincinnati. The press asked my daughter, his widow, if she too someday would be buried in Cincinnati, and she replied, that would be a fate worse than death. Alice outlived all of her younger siblings, living to the age of 96, well into the administration of President James Earl Carter. And I do believe her personality delightfully summed up by a needlepoint message that was on a pillow on her settee. The message on the pillow said, if you don't have anything nice to say about someone, come sit next to me. I think we all know someone like Alice, or at least we should. Contrasting sophisticated Alice, on the other end of the family spectrum were the youngest boys, Archie and Quentin, 7 and 4 years old or thereabouts when we entered the White House. As the boys grew, so did their mischief. They and their friends, known as members of the White House Gang. so named by the members of the Washington, D.C. police force and the Secret Service, who so often were the targets of their shenanigans and their spitballs. One story illustrative. In the middle of winter, after a heavy midwinter snow, I left the White House for an appointment. I ascended an open-air carriage. As I did so, one Washington, D.C. police officer gave me a crisp salute. And as the tips of his fingers hit the brim of his helmet, so did a 30-pound snowball drop from the White House roof. The snowball smashed through the officer's helmet and left him knocked out cold in the driveway. I did not need to investigate. I turned over my shoulder. I said, "Boys, get down here immediately." Down the little boys came. They apologized profusely. They meant to frighten us for fun, not to harm anyone. I looked into the issue, and I discovered that officer was long overdue for a promotion. The children enjoyed themselves in great part, for the White House was a veritable zoo, a menagerie of animals like you, cats and dogs, perhaps horses. But I wonder if any of you, even here in Wisconsin, does any of you have a pet badger? I do not recommend it. Our badger, Josiah, did terrible things to the people's furniture with its 3- and 4-inch claws. We had a one-legged rooster and a parrot that on command shouted, "Hurrah for Roosevelt!" Rather partial to the parrot myself. The most famous of the children's pets was the calico pony Algonquin. We had stables next to the White House in those days. Mrs. Roosevelt and I went out riding nearly every evening when I was home. One morning, Quentin, the youngest, brought the pony Algonquin, muddy hooves and all, into the front door of the White House, down the hallway, into the freight elevator, up the freight elevator to the 2nd floor, down the hallway, and into his brother Archie's bedroom. They were rather easy to track and discover. Asked why he brought the pony into the White House, Quentin explained his brother Archie wasn't feeling well, and he knew that Archie would feel better if he could just see his favorite pony. I can't explain the science or the medicine of the thing, but Archie did get better. I thank you for allowing me to reminisce about life in the White House. And if I find any statement of regret in my record whatsoever, it's that on election night in 1904, when I was being elected by the largest electoral vote and popular vote plurality in our history, in a contested election to that date, that I told my family and the press gathered about that night that under no circumstance would I be a candidate for the presidency in 1908, that I would observe the tradition of George Washington of serving no more than 2 terms in the executive, and that I would observe that tradition not only in its letter, but in its spirit. I would consider the 3 1/2 years that I was serving to complete the term of our mounted President McKinley to be my first term, and this now being elected in my own right, no longer an accidental president, come to the presidency through the graveyard, I would consider this to be my 2nd term. Mrs. Roosevelt winced when I said those words, and later that night in private, my most valuable counselor said, "Theodore, that was not a very wise thing to say." Mrs. Roosevelt knew I just declared myself a lame duck for my entire 2nd term. If I had troubles with Congress in my 1st term, which I did, they would be redoubled in my 2nd term, and they were. And perhaps one point for illustration as we come near conclusion. 1903, I toured the country by train, came here to La Crosse, and went back to Medora, where my friends and neighbors came by horseback and buckboard. We had a little square dance. I made a speech, and I'm certain I had seconds on pie. I went to Yellowstone. When I was your president and I went on vacation, I did not go golfing. I went hunting and camping, and the latter in the national parks of this country. And after 2 weeks of observing the elk and the bison, the grizzly, and the bighorn sheep, traveling with John Burroughs, the great birdman of New York's Catskills, I laid at Gardner, Montana, the cornerstone of what is today known as Roosevelt Arch, above which are the words from the Organic Act, creating that our first national park in 1872 for the benefit and enjoyment of the people. That's you. Our national parks have been said to be America's greatest idea, and indeed, they are the most democratic of our institutions. The national parks belong to you, and to each and to all of us. Hence, to each and to all the responsibility to pass these parks on to future generations in better condition and not in worse. It was on that trip that I hiked and camped and tramped for 3 days and nights at Yosemite with John Muir, the great bearded botanist of the Sierra Nevadas, founder of the Sierra Club. And for the first time in my life, I saw the Grand Canyon of the Colorado River in Arizona Territory. Have you seen the Grand Canyon? Good. We saved it for you. I returned after having told the people of Arizona Territory, do nothing to it. that the ages had been at work upon it, and that nothing that we did could improve it. Anything that we did would only mar it. What we could do is preserve it for our children and our children's children. For Americans and future generations not yet born in the womb of time is the one great sight which every American able to do so should see. I enthusiastically returned to the nation's capital, and in my subsequent message to Congress, today you called it the State of the Union, I specifically requested the Congress to name the Grand Canyon a national park. And each and every year, Congress refused. I don't mean to offend your modern sensibilities, but in my day, there were members of Congress working with special interests on Wall Street, working hand in pocket. Perhaps I'm not offending your modern sensitivities on this point. Can you imagine what a crime it would be today if the Grand Canyon were a giant copper mining operation? If at night the rim of that canyon was surrounded by the lights of hotels and casinos? In 1908, when Congress still refused to name the Grand Canyon a national park, I used the powers of the Monuments and Antiquities Act, passed by Congress under the able leadership of Congressman John Fletcher Lacey of Oskaloosa, Iowa. He who gave us the Lacey Act, making it a federal crime to hunt game illegally in one state and transport that across state lines. When he gave us the Monuments and Antiquities Act, Congress delegated to the presidency the executive authority to name certain public lands of historic, prehistoric, or scientific interest as national monuments. Of the 18 times I did so, I used the power first to declare Devil's Tower in Wyoming a national monument, Lassen Volcano and Muir Woods in California, Mount Olympus in Washington, and the Petrified Forest in Montezuma's Castle in Arizona, Jewel Cave in South Dakota. And in January of 1908, when Congress refused to name the Grand Canyon a national park, I signed an executive order naming the entire Grand Canyon a national monument. I said Congress would eventually come about its senses. In the immediate aftermath of my signing the executive order, Speaker of the House Joe Cannon of Danville, Illinois, he who had said, "Not 1 cent for scenery," he said of me, "President Roosevelt has as much use for the Constitution as a tomcat has for a marriage license." I said the Constitution's made for the people, not the people for the Constitution. There is no more nobler sport than fighting for the right as you see the right to do, and as you see the right to do. And shame upon us as a people if we think we must indeed agree on every particular policy, or candidate, or office holder, and otherwise denigrate one another. Any public man or public woman wishing to accomplish anything must compromise. The Constitution itself is a bundle of compromises. Oh, now there you might bristle, as one senator did so at the White House. He said, "Mr. President, you're preaching." I said, "Senator, you're right. And the presidency is a bully pulpit, too." One of the many phrases I've left you. I left you another. When Senator La Follette of Wisconsin criticized me in my leadership of the Progressive Party, criticized me for my record of having compromised with the conservative wing of the Republican Party to get things done, I said that every forward-thinking movement has within its ranks the lunatic fringe. So whether on the left or the right, avoid the lunatic fringe. The vast majority of Americans are right here in the middle. What a fine example you give us from the middle of the country, here from Wisconsin. I've got a fond place for you, Wisconsin, right here. You'll notice I didn't say over here by my heart, over here by my right lung. For during that 1912 campaign, I brought the campaign October 14th to Milwaukee. I left the Hotel Gilpatrick, bound for the Milwaukee Auditorium to address thousands of progressive citizens. I ascended in an open automobile. I turned and waved to the enthusiastic crowd outside the hotel. When I did so, a madman reached into the automobile and shot me at close range with a .38 caliber. The bullet pierced my overcoat and my folded speech, my steel eyeglass case, lodged deep in my chest and knocked me down in the automobile in which I was riding. I first stood and, in the spirit of McKinley, made sure that no vigilante justice was done to the madman that shot me. But then, being a hunter and a former soldier, I knew to spit into my palm and to check my spittle. There was no blood in my spittle. My lung was not punctured. It was but a mere flesh wound. I refused medical attention. I demanded to go and make my speech to the thousands awaiting at the auditorium. The automobile took me thither. I climbed upon the stage. I pulled my jacket to the side. I showed the audience my bloody blouse. I said, "You must bear with me. You may not understand. I've just been shot, but it takes more than a bullet to kill a bull moose. I spoke for 80 minutes with a bullet in my chest. And right now, House management is wondering what it will take to get me to stop hollering at you here at Viterbo this evening. I'm sure I do come near conclusion. But I did want to share with you some of these stories tonight. For the prize is to be won by the man or the woman who's in the arena. I spoke in April 1910 at the Sorbonne. I made a speech there representing the oldest republic in the world, speaking to the citizens of the second oldest republic. I made a speech there called Citizenship in a Republic, and I recommend the speech in its entirety to you, and you're all relieved to know I shall not recite the speech in its entirety. It is a small portion that remains famous to this day. How it delights me to know that these words today are stenciled below decks on the USS Theodore Roosevelt. The Navy calls that great nuclear aircraft carrier, 5,000 Navy and Marine Corps personnel aboard, the big stick, is in the old African proverb I was wont to quote, and first did so at the State Fair in St. Paul in 1901. Speak softly and carry a big stick, you will go far. I know that you here at the university and in the community, so many of you are involved in doing good deeds for education, for conservation, for the arts, historic preservation, and more. Well, this is America. No good deed goes unpunished. Certainly no good deed goes without its second-guessing, its Monday morning quarterbacking, its criticism. Persist in your good deeds. The Republic needs them now more than ever. And when you are criticized, I hope you might take heart from what I said over a century ago and share with you here tonight in La Crosse. Do your good deeds, and when criticized, remember, it is not the critic who counts. Not the man who points out how the strong man stumbled or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man, and today to the woman, who's actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs and comes up short again and again, because there is no effort without error or shortcoming, but who knows the great devotions, the great enthusiasms, who spends herself in a worthy cause, and who, in the end, at the best, knows the triumph of high achievement, and who, at the worst, if he fails, at least he fails while daring greatly, and his name shall never be with those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat. Good citizens, we've all known victory, we've all known defeat. We're all human, we all prefer the former over the latter. But I've shared some of these stories with you in brief tonight, and do so at greater length with school children throughout the country to give encouragement. Why, what if when I was a little boy I'd allowed myself to think of myself and define myself as a weak and sickly invalid? Instead, through hard work in the outdoors, building my body. As a young man, I ran for the mayorship of New York, as you heard from Professor Kite. I came in third out of 3. That's last place. What if I had given up on politics and public service after such a humiliating defeat in my home city? I would have never become your president, fighting for the square deal. The reason, by the way, that the artist Gutzon Borglum says I am atop Mount Rushmore with the other 3. And indeed, what if as a young man I'd allowed that terrible twin tragedy that befell me that St. Valentine's Day to derail my life? Instead, going west and going into the great outdoors, healing, getting back in the family way, 17 grandchildren. No, indeed. To each and every one of us, even the youngest amongst us, we know life will knock you down. Your duty to yourself, to your family, indeed to the Republic, is that when life does knock you down, you're to get back up again, dust yourself off, and get back into the fight for life. Well, there I go again from the bully pulpit. Perhaps I should conclude with a bit of uncharacteristic humility. I don't believe I'm any more remembered for my Nobel Peace Prize, given to me for settling the Russo-Japanese War with the Treaty of Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Not for my Medal of Honor, awarded posthumously more than a century after the action in Cuba for the charge up Kettle Hill. Not for the Pure Food and Drug Act, or railroad rate regulation, the federal meat inspection, the Panama Canal, and the Great White Fleet. All of it so much dust in the streets of history. I think I'm actually best remembered for the legacy of a failure. A failed bear hunt in Onward, Mississippi in 1902. My friends from Mississippi and Louisiana on this bear hunt attempted to outdo one another with regards to southern hospitality. Those of you that are sportsmen or sportswomen understand you can either have a good hunt or a good picnic. You generally cannot have them both at the same time, in the same place, and I'm sure we scared every bear out of the Delta by the end of that third night. On that night, the famous hunting guide Holt Collier of Greenville, Mississippi, a slave in his youth and body servant to his master during the Civil War, during the occupation of Vicksburg, he killed a Union captain, charges dismissed by a sympathetic Southern jury. The most prolific of the hunting guides in the Delta, he came to camp that third night and said, "Mr. President, I shall have you a bear by morning if I need to bring it into camp on the end of a rope." We all laughed. The next morning, before dawn, Mr. Collier and I were out early, but we found no trail, no spoor whatsoever, returning to camp. Later, from my tent, I heard men yelling and dogs barking, a man blowing a trumpet. I ran out from my tent, and there indeed, Mr. Collier had tethered an old wounded male bear to a tree. The bear was greatly wounded on its chest. Hunting dogs had attacked the bear. The bear killed 2 of the hunting dogs. Mr. Collier, wanting to save his prize hunting dogs, but fearing to fire his rifle for fear of harming his dogs, he went into the shallow water in which the bear and the dogs were wrestling, and he broke the barrel of his gun across the bear's head. The bear was bleeding from a great gash and wound on its head. When the bear was dazed by the blow, Mr. Collier tied one end of his lariat around the bear's neck, dove and tied the other end to a tree. And this horrific scene was the scene upon which I came, rushing from my tent. My horror compounded when one in my hunting party said, "Mr. President, there's your bear. Go ahead and shoot your bear." What a cowardly thing that would have been to do. Of course, I refused to shoot the bear. The story embarrassingly spread throughout the country. The cartoonist Clifford Berryman drew a cartoon of the incident, called it "Drawing the Line in Mississippi." The cartoon showed me refusing to shoot a small bear cub tied to a tree. When I returned to the White House, I received there a letter from the Michtom family, small candy makers, toy manufacturers in Brooklyn, New York, eventually the Ideal Toy Company of New York City. Mrs. Michtom, in her letter to me, asking permission to make a stuffed bear and to name it after me. I wrote back. I said, "You may go ahead and do so, but I don't think it will help your sales very much at all." I wonder if any of you have known the love and comfort of what then was called Teddy's bear, with the apostrophe possessive S, Teddy's bear. Do any of you still have your teddy bear? Oh, up with your hands, men. Real men have teddy bears. I see some of you ladies have married your teddy bears. That's the way that works. The toy manufacturers, enthused by the unexpected profits that came from the sale of Teddy's bear, they thought they might equally profit if they made a stuffed animal and named it in honor of each and every subsequent resident of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, the White House. But I'm afraid, in honor of President William Howard Taft and for the toy manufacturers, America's mothers never really took kindly to putting Billy the Possum in with the children at night. The teddy bear reigned supreme. I was the first president to make permanent office space available for members of the press at the White House, something I'm sure many of my successors deeply regret. But I would be remiss, with the assistance of Mr. Wilkins and the technicians here, if I might have the house lights up a little bit, perhaps as we conclude, perhaps one or two of you might have some good question from the history department or from your ethics program. And delightful to see that so few of you escaped during this longish sort of lecture. Anyone at all, some sort of vignette that you wish to be told tonight that hasn't some query about my family, nothing too private, better to hash it out here in the auditorium than see it on the tabloid front page at the supermarket. Anyone at all, don't be shy. Right there, would you stand up, sir, that we all might hear you as you shout out, "What's your name, sir?"
Mark.
What's your last name, Mark?
Sandheinrich.
Sandheinrich?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Sandheinrich, the floor is yours, sir.
Mr. President, could you tell us something about your trips down the Amazon?
My goodness, 1913, 1914, and some explanation. For when I left the White House in 1909, I was but 50 years old, younger than all but 2 of my predecessors had been when they became President of the United States. I had 6 children, a growing number of grandchildren, and there was no presidential pension. I had to earn a living. The pension would come into law when Congress discovered that President and Mrs. Truman were spending their meager savings to purchase letterhead, envelopes, and stamps to respond to the thousands of congratulatory letters they received in their retirement in Missouri. So I edited the Outlook magazine professionally. I wrote newspaper articles for Mr. William Allen White and the Emporia Gazette, syndicated throughout the country. And I made speeches in exchange for remuneration. I've never made Clinton money, but I'm doing all right. And in 1913, an educational foundation in South America invited me and Mrs. Roosevelt to come and make an honorarium for making some speeches, and then governments joined in. And the Brazilian government augmented their invitation, asking if I would like to explore a river, the headwaters of which had been discovered a few short years before by Colonel Candido Rondon of the Brazilian Army. He famous for stretching the first telegraphic wire across the Amazon, and very often losing men to disease and death or desertion along the way. He discovered the headwaters of this river. The headwaters, no river appeared on his map, hence his naming it in Portuguese the Rio da Dúvida, the River of Doubt in English, not knowing where it went. I accepted the invitation, and the Roosevelt-Rondon expedition was born. It was fortunate that my son Kermit, the boy who hunted with me in Africa, he was now working for banking and mining interests in South America, and when we met up, Mrs. Roosevelt, his mother, prevailed upon Kermit to join Father and keep an eye on Father. Our trip was calamitous. We thought we would hunt for game in the jungle, as we'd done in Africa. The game showed themselves quite scarce, a few monkeys or snakes that disappeared a few yards into the foliage. As for fishing in the river was full of piranha, more likely to eat us than we they. By the time we'd come across the Mato Grosso, the great plateau, most of the Brazilian scientists had deserted the effort. Our oxen had died, and supplies and food were left along the trail. When we made the headwaters of the river, we purchased and traded for heavy dugout canoes. And how unfortunate that every 2 or 3 miles along that river, we seemed to reach another gorge or waterfalls where we had to haul out those heavy soaked canoes and build a corduroy road, hacking through the jungle with our machetes, pushing and pulling these 1- and 2-ton boats, then back into the water to be repeated ad nauseum. We were down on quarter rations. One Brazilian trooper drowned. Another trooper, mad with fever and starvation, being caught a second time stealing rations, he murdered one of his officers and ran off into the jungle, surely to his own demise, for we were surrounded by people of the Santiago tribes, the Wide Belt tribes, some of whom still practiced cannibalism and hunted their human quarry with poison darts. I dashed my leg to the bone trying to save some canoes from being busted up, and developed a serious infection, and also nearly succumbed to a malarial fever. For 2 days and nights, the entire safari lay still, me lying in the bottom of a canoe. My temperature, 105 degrees. I always took with me on my adventures enough morphine to take my own life, and in case of a terrible gun accident or bear mauling or such, I never wanted to be a fatal burden to my party, which I threaten to do now on the River of Doubt. 105 degrees, in my fever I was in delirium, reciting over and over again a favorite line from Coleridge. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree. In Xanadu. Sir, after 2 days of that, I would have shot me. But my son Kermit said, Father, I'm going to take you out of this jungle alive or dead, and it will be marginally easier to do so if you remain alive. With those words, Kermit saved my life. I recuperated, restored my health. We finished mapping the river, and even before concluding our trip down the River of Doubt, knowing that salvation and civilization were upon us when we first reached the remote rubber taps, then it was that the Brazilian government announced that the Rio da Dúvida would be called the Rio Roosevelt, and one of its tributaries, the Rio Kermit. We'd put the family name on the map. It was my last chance to be a boy, and most physicians have assured me now that when I was in my grave 5 years hence, it was in great part for the fact that my blood and my pulmonary system had been damaged greatly by the recurrent malarial fever. It caused a condition in my blood that, combined with the fact that as a young boy I did taxidermy without wearing gloves, so that I had a poisoning in my blood from arsenic and mercury. It's these conditions that led to my pulmonary embolism. I died January 6, 1919. I was 60 years old. I said I would rather wear out than rust out. Aldo Leopold died in the field of fire, in a way. I wish that I might have given my life on the fields of France for my country. My son Quentin would give his all in France in World War I, and Ted Jr. and Kermit dying in the service of his country in World War II. But you know the story of Aldo Leopold, dying of a heart attack after attempting to put out a fire on his neighbor's farm in the service of others. His land ethic and his life are a lesson to each and every one of us. And for me to have played a small part in your celebration of the life and legacy of Aldo Leopold means a great deal to me. I do know that we might be able to visit all night about my favorite subject, me. Peter Finley Dunn, a Chicago newspaperman, he critiqued my book, The Rough Riders. He said it was called Alone in Cuba, and that the typesetters ran out of the capital letter I. But I hope I've been appropriately humble in sharing my stories with you. Each and every one of us is called to serve, and the brightest days of this country are before us. But do remember what I said. We can truly never be a great country until we are a good country for all of our citizens. I look forward to visiting with you in the auditorium. I'm going to not shake hands this evening. I've got a great deal of traveling to do about the country, and I don't want to be the fellow we read about in the newspapers having not done his proper duty with regards to the orders for the Surgeon General and the recommendations being made. But if you'd like to visit and take some pictures, let's go ahead and do so out in the auditorium. And would you join me in 3 cheers for Viterbo and for Aldo Leopold? Hip, hip, hooray! Hip, hip, hooray! Hip, hip, hooray! Let's go out and play. Bully! Bully! All right. Bully! 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 Thank you all so very, very much. Bully, Professor Kite! Bully!
I thought